As we continue on in the passage of the Gospel according to John, and we've just read through that passage, one of the things that we see is each sign points to Jesus and declares something about him. And in one sense, when we read through this passage, one of the questions we have to ask, because Jesus is being accused of breaking the Sabbath. And the question really is, was he the breaker or the maker of the Sabbath? Was he the breaker of the Sabbath, or was he actually the maker of the Sabbath? Now, how many of you like playing games? Maybe a board game or an activity game or something. Imagine if you went to an event where it was just a whole bunch of games, and you found your favorite game, and you sat down, and you began to play with another individual. And throughout that game, you tried to correct the other person because they weren't playing by the rules. Now, of course, how many of you have family rules? But comes to find out, the person you're actually playing with was the one who designed and created the game. Imagine there you are, you're trying to correct them because of all your family rules, and yet you're speaking to the one who actually has created the rules. In a sense, when we go into this passage, looking at Jesus as the signs, what you find is they were accusing him of breaking the Sabbath, but really it was the family rules of the Sabbath, the tradition of the elders of the Sabbath. But yet standing before them was the one who was the maker of the Sabbath. Now, as we look on throughout this passage, and we're into the third sign, really the first two was really bringing out and stirring up intrigue about Jesus. He made water into wine, removed the embarrassment for the person hosting the party, the wedding, but it was all a picture about him as a redeemer, the one who had come into the world. Then we see the man who had to trust what other eyewitnesses had said about Jesus and the promise and the words of Jesus, and had to walk away from Jesus, an 8-hour journey back to his house, believing that his son would live based on the promise that Jesus had given. But very similar today. None of us were eyewitnesses back then, but we have to trust the words of the eyewitnesses that have been passed down to us, the words and the promise of Jesus, and we have to believe, not just without evidence, but the evidence that has been set before us. Now, as we come to this passage, in the very first verse, it mentions after this, straight after, the chapter 4 finishes with the second miracle he had done up in Galilee. Jesus heads back to Jerusalem. It says, after this was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches. So as we just kind of open up this chapter, and as Jesus heads back to Jerusalem, one of the interesting things about the Gospel according to John, it records the least amount of miracles, but at the same time, it records the most that happened in Jerusalem or the surrounding area of Jerusalem. Much of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, their description and their records are mostly of what happened up in the Galilee area, around the Sea of Galilee. John focuses more in Jerusalem because he's focusing more on the identity of Jesus Christ and the conflict that he stirred up intentionally in Jerusalem with the religious leaders, and how the Hebrew Scriptures were pointing to him as the Messiah. So there he is. Jesus heads back to the feast. Everything seems to be calm up to this point, until this point. As Jesus is there, it mentions about this pool, Bethesda. Now, For many years, skeptics tried to point at this passage and say, this didn't really happen because there is no pool of Bethesda by the sheep gate. Until about 150 years ago, archaeologists discovered exactly as John described this pool of Bethesda. And really, if anything, this points and even gives more credibility to the Gospel of John because of the description that he used. Well, what was happening here at this pool, it mentions, in these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was made well of whatever disease he had. Now it mentions about all of these individuals crowding around this pool. Why were they there? Well, it mentions about an angel. Now, this was a superstition of what was believed in the area. In fact, archaeologists have discovered there was a spring that fed this pool, and in the spring, well, it would have caused a bubbling up at certain times. The superstition was that any time it bubbled up, it must be an angel that was causing this, not recognizing it was a spring. And so there was a belief, if I could get in the pool, when the water stirs around, it must be caused by an angel, we will have healing. But imagine this scene as it describes. There lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed, all waiting for the water to move. How many of you like walking into the waiting room at the hospital? And it's just, well, one, everybody's waiting. Two, everybody's there for a reason. You have some people, and you're like, okay, I'll try to keep my distance. I want to try to come to the hospital and get better, not worse. Then you see some people that are, well, you might see some blood, whatever the case is. When you walked into this area, it would have been like a waiting room, but worse. There was no nurses there, no doctors to help, nobody moving quickly through the system. Well, that might be similar to the waiting room, right? There were no toilets in the area to where they could be rushed off to when they needed to use it. Nobody to clean them. Think about what it might have looked like and also what it might have smelt like. It would not have been a place that the average person would have wanted to go. It would not have been the place where a healthy person would have wanted to go. In fact, it would have been a place that most people would have avoided like the plague because it was like the plague. But this is exactly where Jesus steps in. Jesus enters into this pool, into this area. It mentions in verse 6, or in verse 5, now a certain man was there who had an infirmity 38 years. Think about that. Now, we don't know how long he had been by the pool. He may not have been there by the pool for 38 years, but he had this infirmity. Later on, we find out he's paralyzed. He couldn't walk. He couldn't get out and about. He had no ability to get down into the pool, even if there was a stirring. And it says, when Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had been in that condition a long time, he said to him, do you want to be made well? Now you might think, what kind of question is that? As Jesus enters in, now one of the things that's interesting, there's multitude of people, but we only see Jesus healing one individual. Some people would say, well, if he was truly compassionate, he would have just cleared out the whole lot. He would have just healed everyone. Well, there's many things that we can think about, because later on, as we look throughout the passage, physical healing is not the ultimate healing. There is a greater healing that needs to take place than just the physical healing. In fact, every one of these signs that Jesus did would all come to an end eventually. Think about that for a moment. The water that he had turned into wine because they had run out, eventually ran out. The boy that Jesus brought back to life, or healed him from dying, and he was restored and made whole, eventually did die. Later on, this lame man, well, there would come a day that he wouldn't be able to walk because he'd be in the grave. And every single one that we look at, they were all temporary, but they were all pointing to something that was permanent. They were all temporary and physical, but they were pointing to the one who would restore eternally and spiritually. But he asks that question, do you want to be made well? Now, this is something that we have to ask ourselves. Do we want to be made well? Not everybody wants to be made well. And you would think this man, of course, he would want to be made well. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been there. In fact, that's what he describes. He says, the sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I am coming, another steps down." Now, many people enjoy complaining about their problems. And if the problems were removed, they would have nothing to talk about. Have you ever met individuals like that? And sometimes you might ask, do you want to be made better? Well, it's almost as though they enjoy being ill. Not physically, but many different ways. Do you want to be made well? With ability comes a responsibility. No longer could he sit there and receive the sympathy of everybody around him. In fact, he would have a responsibility to do something with the ability that he had been given to him. But also when we think about spiritually, Jesus also asks the question today, do you want to be made well? Many people searching for peace, searching for hope, searching for something, for the guilt and the shame to be removed. And yet Jesus says, do you want to be made well? And he stands just as he is standing in front of this man. And this man says, you know what? I would love to be made well, but I have nobody to help me. Now, he did not realize that he was speaking to the giver of life, the one who could heal him, who did not have to wait for any stirring of the water, but he was that living water and also the healer. And Jesus speaks to him. He says, Jesus said to him, "Rise, take up your bed and walk." And immediately the man was made well, took up his bed, and walked. Immediately. Jesus gives him a question, do you want to be made well? And the man says, yes, but I have nobody to help me. And he says, rise, take up your bed, and walk. Now, what is interesting about this, one, John just kind of moves on. He gives very little emphasis on the actual miracles. It happened. Jesus said it. It happened. He moves on. The point is, it wasn't just about the miracle. The miracle was not the only part of the sign. Why didn't Jesus say, rise up and walk? Why did Jesus have to put those little few words, take up your bed? If Jesus would have just said, rise and walk, there wouldn't have been any issue. But Jesus intentionally told him to take up his bed because he wanted a conversation brought about. It says there in verse 10, the Jews therefore said to him who was cured, it is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your bed. Now, many times throughout the other gospel records, you see Jesus doing a miracle, a crowd around him, the religious leaders sitting there in the crowd, one, the man that had the withered hand. And he asks the question with the people around him, and then he heals the man. Another, when the man is lowered down through the roof, and many different miracles. In the religious crowd, they were sitting there watching him. There was no religious crowd sitting around in this part, because no religious man would have entered into that pool, because the idea was, if you were physically ill, it must be because you are spiritually ill. You have a physical problem because you have a spiritual problem, and it was very much believed that the two went together. In fact, when we come to the healing of the blind man, even the disciples asked Jesus, who sinned? Was it this man or his parents sinned? Because obviously his blindness must have been brought about because of sin. And Jesus says it was neither this man's sin nor his parents' sin, but that God's work can be done. The religious crowd would have stayed away from this area. They never would have known about Jesus' miracle on the Sabbath day if it wasn't for this man walking down the street carrying his cot. But as soon as they saw him carrying a cot, you are breaking the law. You are a sinner. You are condemned. Now it's interesting, this man, he just plays complete innocence. It's very different from the blind man in John chapter 10. Extremely different. This man, I don't know what you're talking about. You go talk to the man who made me well. It's all him. He told me to get up. He told me to carry my bed. And maybe he thought, you know what? If he has the authority to go against the physical laws, maybe he has the authority to go against the religious laws as well. And he says, verse 11, he answered them, he who made me well said to me, take up your bed and walk. Then they asked him, who is this man who said to you, take up your bed and walk? But the one who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, a multitude being in that place. So when Jesus had healed him, Jesus kind of just slipped out of the crowd. This man stands up, picks up his bed, looks around. Jesus is nowhere to be found. No, he can't thank him. He can't ask him any more questions. So, well, he told me to rise, take up my bed and walk. I have been able to rise. I need to walk, and I guess I'll go ahead and take my bed too. Maybe he didn't even know the day. We don't know how long he had been there. And if you're like me, when there isn't a whole lot going on, it's hard to even keep track of what day it is, right? And sometimes with school, with church, with set schedules, I've got to be here, I've got to be there, and it keeps our days in order. But when you're on holiday, it's like, what day is it? But he points and says, it was Jesus who told me to do this. Now it goes on, it says there in verse 13, or in verse 14, afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, see, you have been made well. Sin no more, lest the worst thing come upon you. And the man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. Now, some may read through this and think, well, his original sin his original illness must have been caused because of sin. Because Jesus is saying, don't continue in sin, otherwise something worse is going to happen. I don't believe that's what Jesus is saying. But what is worse than not being able to stand in this life? Well, what's worse is standing before God without eternal life. Standing before God, and one day, and as we look through here, Jesus speaks about himself being the judge. And as we stand before God and give an account of ourselves and our sin, that will be worse than being by a pool for 38 years, unable to walk. And Jesus says, see, you have you have been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you. Now, in one sense, maybe he was using it as irony against what the people had been telling him. Because when they said, you have broken the law, what they're really saying is, you are sinning. God's judgment is going to be upon you. And yet Jesus had just told him to carry his bed. Now, really going back to that, Jesus was not telling him to break God's law. It was breaking the tradition of the elders. And in the Jewish mind, we have the Ten Commandments. We have the written Torah, the written law from the Old Testament. What we have been passed down to Moses and was recorded and written down. But the Jews also believed there was an oral law, a spoken law that was never actually written down. And in this law, the oral law, it gave a whole list of 39 categories, not just 39 things you couldn't do on a Sabbath day. It was 39 categories of things you could not do on the Sabbath day. And carrying something was one of them. In fact, even today, if you're familiar with Jews and things that they're allowed to do or not do on the Sabbath, you may have an oven that has kind of a setting that you don't have to touch it to make it function, and you can just plan it ahead, and part of that is for the Jews. So they can set it on Friday evening, set everything in the timer, and they don't have to push any buttons. I've heard of people going up to a lift, and somebody's standing there, and they think, well, they must have pushed the button, but nobody pushed the button. So then they went up and pushed the button and realized it's actually a Jew, and it's the Sabbath day, and they're not allowed to push a button on the Sabbath day to make the lift work. They can walk onto a lift, but they're not allowed to push any buttons. Think of that. The strictness that became a control, a device in people's lives. But really, God had designed the Sabbath day as a gift for humanity, a gift of a day of rest. And how many of us need a day of rest? That is a gift from God, not something to use to control, but these religious leaders used it as a way to control people rather than recognizing it as a gift for people. But in verse 16, it says, for this reason the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him because he had done these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, my Father has been working until now, and I have been working. Therefore, the Jews sought all the more to kill him because he not only broke the Sabbath, but also said that God was his Father, making him equal with God. Think about that. At this point, in fact, when you come to John chapter 7, when Jesus enters back into Jerusalem, Jesus brings this conversation up. You're wanting to kill me for doing something good on the Sabbath day? And so this was kind of the start of the plot to kill him, the hatred against him. But it was not only about the compassion that he showed on the Sabbath day, healing this man. It was even more than that. It was also a command that he had given to somebody else to break the Sabbath. Not only did he do wrong on the Sabbath day, but he was telling somebody else to do wrong. So now he's basically, in their eyes, a false teacher and a false rabbi. But now they have something even more to kill him. And it was his claim, who he claimed to be. He says, my Father has been working until now, and I have been working. And in their eyes, in their minds, they knew what he was talking about. He was making himself equal with God. He is saying, God is at work and I am doing the Father's work. He is claiming himself as the Son. In fact, when you go on in this passage, in verse 21, It says, "For as the Father raises the dead and gives life to them, even so the Son gives life to whom he will. For the Father judges no one, but has committed all judgment to the Son, that all should honor the Son just as they honor the Father. He who does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. Most assuredly, I say to you, he who hears my word and believes in him who sent me has everlasting life and shall not come into judgment, but is passed from death into life. Most assuredly, I say to you, the hour is coming, and now is, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son to have life in himself, and has given him authority to execute judgment also, because he is the Son of Man." Think about the statements that Jesus is making right here. He's saying that God has granted him the authority to judge all. Now, imagine, as you consider what the statement of Jesus declaring himself as judge, here they are trying to judge him for breaking the Sabbath, and yet he is the true judge. They're trying to say he was breaking the Sabbath, but yet he is the maker of the Sabbath, and they had altered with their family rules, the tradition of the elders. And even in verse 26, it says, "For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son to have life in himself." What is he saying? Well, remember going back to the very first passage, John chapter 1 and verse 4. In him is life. God does not rely on anything or anyone to live. He is self-sufficient. We rely, we need food, we need water, we need oxygen, we need heat, and we rely on God himself just for our physical life. He says God exists and needs nothing to exist. But also the Son, who is God, in him is life. He is life. But also, going back to verse 24, "Most assuredly I say to you, he who hears my words and believes in him who has sent me has everlasting life and shall not come into judgment." Jesus is pointing out he is the judge, but he's also the Savior. And all of those that put their faith and trust and believe in him and the work that he has done will not receive judgment. In fact, it says, "Most assuredly I say to you," or it says, "but has passed from death into life." What he's also saying is, although we are alive physically, those who do not know Jesus is dead spiritually. Although we are alive physically, if we do not know Jesus and put our faith and trust in him, we are dead spiritually. Which goes back to the conversation that Jesus had with Nicodemus, that you must be born again. Not something that our works can do. In fact, later on in the passage, as they're pointing back to Moses, Jesus says, "I'm not the one accusing you. Moses is the one who is accusing you." It's the law that points out that we have failed God. It is the law that points it out and says, we have sinned, we have failed. And Jesus, when he steps into the world, even John chapter 3, he did not come to condemn the world because that condemnation is already upon us. But he came to save. He came to deliver. He came to pass us from death into life because he is life. He's coming declaring his identity of who he is. He's not the breaker of the Sabbath. He is the maker of the Sabbath. He is not the one who is to be judged. He is the judge, the one who will judge all individuals. But he's also come to be the Savior who died in our place, went to the cross for our sins, but he rose again that third day so that we could have life. Not just physically getting up after 38 years, but one day die physically, but spiritually we would have life for all eternity.